That's a very generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me back here to the Leeds Art Gallery where I spent so many happy hours. As Nigel said, the book was actually written and published in 1990, but it was about the process of about 5 or 6 years' work, in fact, which turned into a PhD. I've not done an awful lot of work on it since, I have to say, whereas some very, very good work has been done on Trana and Tom Heron and other people in the meantime. And it's in grievous need of being of a new edition, which I might or might not get around to, but maybe somebody else will. Anyway, what I'm going to do is to read a text. I'm not very good at talking extemporary, and it should take about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and which should leave us some time for a discussion afterwards, I hope. Right, I wish I'd thought that the title Into the Vortex before I offered the name up to the gallery, because it actually makes more sense, and you'll see why as we go along. Okay. I want to take the liberty of extending the idea of war to cover the entire decade 1910 to 1920, one of the most rebellious and innovative periods in the history of British art. By contrast, in cultural terms, we now live in a comparatively quiet period. Few artists today issue manifestos about their work or programme revolutionary intentions. Art seems not to matter so much, so long as it sells, of course. And as Gregory Fellow in Sculptor at Allington used to say, art is money. It was not like this in the second decade of the 20th century, when, as Virginia Woolf put it, referring to Roger Fry's 1910 post-impressionist exhibition, human nature changed. This decade witnessed the moment of European high modernism, when the cultural scene was rent by the loud clamour of contesting isms. Impressionism, as Woolf noted, was a thing of the 19th century, and post-impressionism was the bugle call of the 20th. In rapid succession, the European art world witnessed the rise of Cubism, Futurism, Fauvism, Dadaism, Expressionism, Constructivism and Suprematism, Britain's own movement, Vorticism, and many more isms that sparked for a day and then died out. In literature, Romanticism was being contested by the neoclassicism of the French poets and taken up by T.E. Hume in the pages of Arage's New Age, while the poets Ezra Pound, Hilda Doolittle, Richard Aldington and F.S. Flint launched the Imagist Manifesto in London's other cutting-edge journal, The Egoist. Imagism was a corrective to late Victorian romantic mistiness and allied itself to Cubism in painting, the hard-edged image being the goal. The playwright Ashley Dukes, who was Arage's theatre critic in the New Age, remembered contemporary art as the midwife of the Imagist movement, writing that our general interests in abstract art led us especially to a revaluation of the images of poetry. T.S. Eliot, then a hard-up American postgraduate student in London, was swept along by the movement, though never a member. But in 1916 offered the University of Oxford extramural department a syllabus he proposed to teach on contemporary French poetry, in which he argued trenchantly for the new religion of classicism. Intriguingly, the only place he is recorded as having actually given these lectures was no less than Ilkley in 1916. Theresa May would no doubt have had him on the boat back home. Philosophically, the avant-garde was torn between the will-to-power Nietzscheanism, hitherto promoted by Arage, and the élan vital Bergsonianism, being introduced in the years running up to World War I by his pugilistic contributor T.E. Hume. Logical positivism was making its way from Vienna, as was Freudianism, seen as morally subversive and undesirable by the establishment, and finding its first English translations in the pages of the New Age. Politically, the contesting isms included syndicalism, not from France, anarchism in a bombing campaign in London, Bolshevism in Russia and feared to spread to Britain, and in the pages of the New Age, Guild Socialism, a movement for which the seeds were sown, as we shall see in the Leeds Arts Club. Lastly, but not least, the burgeoning women's movement had thrown up feminism and suffragism in their campaign for political rights, the competing claims of which were debated ardently in both the New Age and the Leeds Arts Club. The Egoist, the New Age's rival journal, had in fact begun life a few years earlier as the Free Woman, founded by the Huddersfield feminist and anarchist Dora Marsden. Should I say the beautiful Dora Marsden? And had morphed through the Free Woman into the Egoist as Marsden's political and aesthetic sensibilities had developed. Her co-editor in the new Free Woman was the Leeds suffragette and Arts Club member Mary Goulthorpe. War then was in the air in words and paint well before the actual Great War itself, in ideological campaigns and movements which tore apart the artistic and intellectual fabric of an imperialistically smug Georgian Britain and consigned Victorianism to history. In Leeds, Michael Sadler's war began in earnest in 1913. Appointed as Vice-Chancellor of the Leeds University in 1911, he was still finding his feet, but in an entirely misjudged moment, he had sent university students to strike break in the Leeds municipal strike of 1913, for which he earned the full-blooded censure of the local labour movement, the WEA, and even his own members of staff. This was class war. But he had also received from the painter Vasily Kandinsky in Murnau a very early abstract painting in which, in Sadler's words, Kandinsky had expressed himself in free, non-representational design. The design, he continued, suggested hurled masses in impending collision. The dominant colours were vermilion, purple, black, sulphur, yellow and blood red. Some of the lines in the picture called up thoughts of swift arrows, aircraft and exploding shells. Some years later, Sadler wrote to Kandinsky asking him if he had in fact foreseen the impending war, to which Kandinsky had replied that he had been conscious of a terrible conflict going forward in the spiritual world. The picture in question may well have been Composition 7, of which Sadler owned. Barnsley born, but by 1911 very much the metropolitan intellectual, Michael Sadler was appointed Vice-Chancellor of the University of Leeds as probably the leading educationist in Britain. His luggage included one of the largest and most progressive private collections of contemporary paintings of any British collector, many of which he hung around the walls of the university, giving students their first taste of modern art. His professional project was to transform the young university into a leading educational and cultural centre from what was hitherto largely a technical and medical teaching institution. His art, collection and charisma attracted the challenging London critic Frank Rutter to the post of director of Leeds Art Gallery, and together they turned the Leeds Arts Club into the foremost provincial centre for the promotion and practice of post-impressionist painting and theory. He was both a Ruskinian, who would have promoted dignity and labour, and the Nietzschean modern, for whom the intense and silent power of dynamos and turbines were a vital element of a modernist aesthetic. Sadler's modernist vision was developed in the context of a remarkable avant-garde organisation, the Leeds Arts Club, founded by a number of radical artists, teachers and journalists in 1903, including the teacher and journalist Alfred Arage, the York architect A.J. Pensty, author of The Restoration of the Guilds in 1906, and the journalist Holbrook Jackson. Other founders included the Ford sisters from a leading Quaker family, of whom Isabella Ford was a founder of the Independent Labour Party, or the ILP, and feminist activist. Her novel, On the Threshold, included a scathing critique of conventional masculinity and her pamphlet Women and Socialism was widely influential. Much of this first wave feminism passed into the club and nurtured a younger generation of suffragettes, including Mary Gawthorpe. Her sister, Isabella Ford's sister Emily was a fine painter whose work already decorated the University Great Hall. But the leading role in the club was taken by Orage. Orage had arrived in Leeds in 1893 as a newly appointed teacher and immediately became involved in the ILP. The young Orage was also a disciple of the socialist mystic and campaigner for homosexual rights, Edward Carpenter, whose long poem Towards Democracy he virtually knew by heart, and Carpenter lectured frequently for the club. Orage was also a member of the Theosophical Society, then led by the charismatic Annie Besant, whose work Thought Forms will feature later in this talk. The programme of the Arts Club, as Holbrook Jackson later noted, was to reduce Leeds to Nietzscheism. And it was probably the first attempt anywhere in Britain to bring Nietzsche's newly translated work to a wider audience. The core series of evening lectures and discussions over its earlier years tried to fuse Nietzsche's beyond man or Superman ideology with Pater's aestheticism. You see here, this is a syllabus from 1905, Imaginary Portraits of Beyond Man. There are 3 in here. The first one is The Philosopher by Orage. The second one is Imaginary Portraits of Beyond Man, The Artist by Waddington, who is an architect. And the third one, The Saint, and that was by Holbrook Jackson, the journalist who went down with Orage to London. We'll have a look at What is the Use of an Arts Club by George Bernard Shaw in a minute. But you see Isabella Ford is there, talking about women in the state, and a number of other very interesting people talking about interesting things, including Mormon. And Cecil Chesterton was GK's brother. It argued that man was on the brink of a revolutionary change of consciousness and being, which would not be brought about by the timid demands for parliamentary representation sought by the ILP and the Labour movement, but precisely by art. This was heady stuff, and artists and writers regularly travelled from all over the north to listen and debate. The club became a scandalous success in his 1910 election, with the club's affirmation there, which I won't read to you. The club became a scandalous success, especially after George Bernard Shaw had claimed in a talk in 1905 that the best use of an arts club would be to get the good people of Leeds to burn down the city and build a new one in its place, for which he was renamed by the Yorkshire Post George Bernhard Shaw. Shaw then enabled Orage and Holbrook Jackson to buy the alien Christian socialist journal The New Age in order to turn it into a mouthpiece for his own ideas, and Orage and Holbrook Jackson moved to London. That was 1907. Under Orage's editorship, The New Age developed into essential reading for art and politics in London, to which, according to Herbert Reed, all the avant-garde in art and literature was then contributing. Its contributors included Shaw, Chesterton, Belloc, Arnold Bennett, H.G. Wells, G.H. Cole. Ezra Pound was its music critic. Walter Sickert wrote regularly and intelligently on art, but it soon escaped the Fabian clutches of Shaw and spun off in search of the more radical politics of syndicalism and guild socialism, which had its origins in Leeds in the discussions of Arthur Penty and Orage. Nietzscheanism was promoted by Ludovici and Kennedy, while Freud's psychoanalytic theory was translated and reviewed in its pages. Because of the tensions, however, of German expansionism, anti-German feeling was growing in the popular press, not surprisingly led by the Harmsworth's Daily Mail, and Nietzsche was for many who are unlikely to have been acquainted with what he actually wrote, becoming the figure to hate. It was Raj's genius to let the poet, philosopher and pugilist T.E. Hume to have the run of the New Age to promote new tendencies in modern art. Hume wrote a number of seminal essays on modern art, which were like so many jabs in an ageing culture's kidneys. He once had the sculptor Galia Brzeszka make a set of brass knuckles for him. And he claimed on another occasion that the best way to settle an intellectual dispute was by, quote, a little personal violence. Hume introduced the artwork of Kronberg, Wordsworth, Epstein, Wyndham Lewis, Etchells and Galia Brzeszka into the New Age, to house the pain from the older generation. Hume drew substantially on the ideas of French philosopher Henri Bergson and George Sorel. Bergson's theory of the élan vital and his psychologistic description of the creative moment appeared to offer a way into the art of abstraction, while Sorel's notion of the impelling revolutionary myth of the general strike appealed to militants frustrated by the lack of progress in Parliament and the Labour Party. Despite the excitement generated by Hume's pieces, curiously Hume himself described himself as a conservative. This was in part because he drew a decisive distinction between Romanticism and Classicism, calling for the re-establishment of a hard-edged classical discipline in art and ideas. In this he followed some of the European neoclassical proponents like Charles Maurras, leader of the proto-fascist movement L'Action Française. As we have already noted, T.S. Eliot, who was keen both on Hume's New Age articles and Maurras's Action Française. And in his 6 lectures in the autumn of 1916 in Ilkley, he read Hume's poems to the class. Eliot noted that poems of T.E. Hume only needed to be read aloud to have immediate effect. Howls of pain, I suspect. These debates were closely followed and argued over in the Leeds Arts Club, and a number of contributors to the New Age debate spent time in the club, including Charles Ginner and Harold Gilman, who may well have developed, as Thistlewood maintains, their theory of neorealism in Leeds. Another key visitor to the Arts Club was Percy Wyndham Lewis, who brought and introduced an exhibition of Cubist and Futurist art in 1914, shortly before he announced the birth of the Vorticist movement. The club members were also exercised by art and ideas from a different quarter, those of Vasily Kandinsky. As we have seen, Michael Sadler had received and was displaying some of Kandinsky's earliest abstract paintings. Indeed, his son, also rather confusingly named Michael Sadler, later Sadlier, had introduced his father to Kandinsky's work by means of some woodcuts he had brought at Frank Rutter's Allied Artist exhibition in London in 1910 or 11. Both became so enamoured by this new form of expression that, following an urgent visit to Kandinsky in Murnau, Sadler began to translate into English his theoretical text, Über das Geistige in der Kunst, or the art of spiritual harmony. His introduction to Kandinsky's text is revealing in the way he traces at least 2 lines of artistic development into contemporary post-impressionism. The most well-known, claimed Sadler, was a kind of structuralism that was generated by Cézanne and Picasso and passed into Cubism. Sadler rejected this line because he felt it was still fatally rooted in naturalistic representation. His preferred line was the more pure form of abstractionism that could be glimpsed in the late 19th, 20th symbolism, but was matured by Gauguin and Kandinsky. It is this second line that held the promise of spirituality for the Sadlers, and this was this line that was most encouraged in his work with the Leeds Arts Club. The intriguing element of Kandinsky's writing, of course, is that, as he himself acknowledged, it relied heavily on the philosophical writings of Annie Besant and Charles Leadbetter. Published as Thought Forms in 1901 and printed by Percy Lund Humphreys and Co. in Bradford. Sadler did much to aid this experimentation by making his paintings available for exhibitions and lectures. By now his collection included 4 important Gauguins and works by Cézanne, Van Gogh and Klee. Jenner and Gilman, already noted, regularly debated and sketched in Leeds. Jenner wrote, "Each age has its atmosphere, its cities, its people, and art should be concerned with exploring the topical themes and features of its day. Consequently, places where human intervention had shaped and altered the landscape were viewed as sites through which to access authentic reality." This factory could well be Tom Heron's clothing factory in Buslingthorpe Lane in Leeds, of whom more later. Note the precise draftsmanship in these works. The market scene was painted from a detailed drawing made on the spot during a visit to Leeds. The vibrant working-class life of the market and factories provided subject matter for several other Camden Town painters. Jenner and Gilman, as noted, were engaging in the debate over modern art theory in the pages of New Age, in response to Hume's pieces. Their own theory of neorealism, which rejected comprehensive non-representation in painting, and probably owed much to the debates in the Arts Club over Rutter's and Fry's ideas of significant form. There is no evidence that Sadler himself contributed anything new to these debates, other than judiciously chairing them in his customary fashion. It took an educator's delight in sharing his artworks and instructing students in their appreciation. Others from Leeds School of Art, for example, were invited to his house in Headingley, and for one of them, Henry Moore, these were the first, he said, impressionist and post-impressionist works that I had seen. Bill Oliver suggests that even Sadler's buying of old masters was conditioned by their anticipating future developments, suggesting to his students how in certain works they could see emergent trends. Sadler's pamphlet Art and Revolution in 1932 notes the alarm and repugnance shown by the elderly to modern art, and it was not generally shared by the young, and signalled an epochal cultural change. Attracted by the revitalised atmosphere of the club, a young businessman called Tom Heron joined. The son of a Bradford stuff manufacturer, Heron had started a shirt manufacturing factory in Buslingthorpe Lane in Leeds and ran the workplace on worker-friendly lines. Joining the club and meeting with artists profoundly shook his outlook, and he quickly became a patron of the avant-garde. He later reflected that the personal contribution of the painter to art, what he called their style, adds a new interpretation to the subject which reaches beyond the approach of reason to deeper levels of consciousness. And he noted, "It is this process which has enabled artists in every age to civilise the up-and-coming ruling class, the class which has the time and money to spend on art, and by so doing, to make them dissatisfied with the crude ideas about power, wealth, birth, manners, or cleverness, which have raised them to power." I'm sure contemporary Russian oligarchs will agree with them. The most significant painter he met at this time was Bruce Turner. Almost entirely forgotten now, Bruce Turner was one of the club's leading artists experimenting with extractionism. Heron almost immediately began collecting and promoting his work. Significantly, Tom Heron's son Patrick, who was brought up in this atmosphere of experimentation in Leeds, later became a leader of Britain's post-World War II abstract expressionist movement. He thought of Turner's work as utterly avant-garde. It was, he said, a brilliantly gifted expression of a talent quite remarkably attuned to the most creative explorations of the time. In 1964, along with Herbert Reed and Robert Rowe, Patrick Heron organised an exhibition of Turner's works here at the Leeds Art Gallery. In his catalogue notes he wrote, "Turner in those early works showed a boldness and intelligence and a thoroughgoing professionalism, which it seems to me in retrospect must have been unparalleled in the England of 1914. By comparison, Wyndham Lewis seemed unpainterly and General Gilman too conservative." The Metropolitan critic Richard Cork, however, in his book on Vorticism, dismissed Turner as a minor talent. Sadly, Turner was forced to serve a term of brutal imprisonment in Dartmoor for conscientious objection, from which he did not wholly recover, and much of his work has been lost. Here are some of the paintings from the Arts Club this time. Landscape you've just seen, Dying Man, Spring of Truth, and I think one that I like best, The Resting Ploughman, and Pavlova, which Nigel tells me is now in the Tate, reflecting Deschamps' Descending Stairs. And he did this from actually seeing Pavlov at the Grand Theatre in January 1912. Tom Heron was an early advocate of guild socialism, a form of workers' control in industry that represented a kind of fusion between Ruskin and Morrison's devotion to the arts and crafts medieval guilds idea and French syndicalism, minus the violent revolutionary methods. It was a peculiarly English movement which proposed trade unions should turn themselves into incorporated organisations for the control of economic production based on state ownership of industry. This original idea derived from the arts and crafts movement of the late 19th century, conceived by the York architect Arthur Penty, and shaped in conversation with Arage in Leeds and London, was essentially an aesthetic politics, which the authors believed would effect a revolutionary transformation of the life of all citizens, and not just the working class, by creating joyful work and release from what they called, for the first time, wage slavery. During World War I, Arage's New Age promoted the idea vigorously with articles by S.G. Hobson, and won over a number of leading Labour intellectuals, including R.H. Tawney and G.D.H. Cole. Heron carried the spirit, if not the letter, of guild socialism into his business adventures. These included transforming his friend Alec Waters' Crusades fabrics business at St. Ives into a style leader in the 1920s, and then establishing Cresta Silks in Welwyn Garden City. His eminent designers included the Nash brothers, Stanley Spencer, his son Patrick, and of course Turner, and he commissioned Wells Coates, then relatively unknown, to design his Art Deco stores, and this is the one on the Brompton Road. Described by his biographer Pert Binns as a modern medievalist, Heron succeeded in combining a genuine respect for his workers' craftsmanship with the demands of relatively mass production. Later he became associated with the Christian Socialist Chandos Group and Economic Reform Club, as a result of which he was commissioned by the Board of Trade in World War II as an advisor for the government's utility clothing scheme. In fact, according to his biographer, Heron was the active brain and the original mind and force behind the utility clothing scheme, where he invited leading London couturiers such as Norman Hartnell and Harley Amies to design for the people. Sadler's encouragement of artistic experiment in the Leeds Arts Club noted the talents of another especially gifted young painter, Jacob Kramer. Kramer was a Jewish immigrant from the Ukraine, driven out aged 8 with his family by the Tsarist pogroms of the turn of the 20th century and forced into exile, settled in the Jewish community in Leeds in 1900. Again, Theresa May well have showed him the boat back home. This is a bust of him by Jacob Epstein. And Epstein later wrote, "The Leeds painter Kramer was a model who seemed to be on fire. He was extraordinarily nervous. Energy seemed to leap into his hair as he sat, and sometimes he would be shaken by a queer, trembling like ague. I would try to calm him so as to get on with the work." Sadler was very moved by his painting, in which he detected an intense spirituality, and became his patron, introducing him to Kandinsky's work and theory, and enabling him to study at the Slade, frequently buying his paintings or taking them in payment for loans made. Kramer exhibited briefly with Wyndham Lewis's Vortices group, and here is an example of what he called a Vortices sketch. But his friend and fellow member of the club, Herbert Reed, later described him as perhaps Britain's foremost expressionist painter. This is Ruhala, the magnificent Ruhala, and the Jew. And he developed a close relationship with Herbert Reed, with whom he corresponded during the war and met in the art club rooms when Reed was on leave. And the Day of Atonement, of course, is regarded as his masterpiece. Reed's correspondence with Kramer and his contact with the painter himself had a decisive effect on his burgeoning talent as an art critic. Within a decade, Reed was seen as one of the leading theorists of modern art in Britain, and one who did more than anyone else to secure the reputations of Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth. As his correspondence with Kramer reveals, understanding abstractionism was very much a question of constructing a new language of art. For Reed, while T.E. Hume appeared to have resolved the problem of the language of spirituality by replacing it with a more secular metaphor derived from the French philosopher Henri Bergson, whose works he was then translating. Following Bergson, Hume claimed that human creativity consisted in grasping fleeting fragments of imagery, first glimpsed intuitionally. The artist leaves behind the level of naturalistic representation where things are already crystallized into a definite shape, and having dived down into the inner flux, comes back with a new shape which he endeavours to fix. Hence, abstract forms are wrestled from the vast mass of intuitional but chaotic material available to the artist and shaped into simpler mental constructions which were artistically valid. This technical language, as well as the resulting imagery, seemed more appropriate to the modern mechanical age, as well as embracing the insights of Freudian psychoanalysis. But for Reed, Hume's division between Romanticism and Classicism was not so clear-cut, but held in what he called a dialectical tension, rather than being mutually exclusive. In the Romantic road, he believed it was still necessary to embrace Nietzsche's Dionysian element of transgression, pursued by Orage at the club a few years earlier. But this should be complemented by the need for Apollonian classical discipline and simplicity. Thistlewood concluded that while Hume's articles in the New Age were a major influence on Reed and the Arts Club members, Nietzsche was the occasional provider of decisive insights. Reed's correspondence with Kramer shows how even in the context of war, this debate continued to energise discussion. In 1917, Kramer was dividing his time between the membership of the London group, to which he was introduced by fellow Yorkshireman Edward Wadsworth, and painting portraits of Leeds celebrities for an income. It was a time of great emotional upheaval for one whose psychological balance was never the most robust. Many of his friends and colleagues from London had been recruited as war artists, including the Nash brothers, Nevinson, Spencer, Bomberg, and soon Bernard Meninsky, while Wadsworth was working on dazzle camouflage for battleships. And worse, his father had recently died. In Leeds, he decided to volunteer for enlistment in the Jewish regiment, but probably because of his agitated and anxious state, was refused frontline service, and instead, ironically, was to be sent to South Wales to join the 9th Russian Labour Battalion. While waiting, he was invited to speak at the Leeds Arts Club in early 19 on the younger British artists, of which he was now a prominent representative. His central contention was that all art was the expression of spiritual feeling, but found it hard to express in words how that conformed to the spiritual idea in his mind. He had prepared a number of drawings to illustrate how colour, line and mass form could represent feelings, such as beauty, passion, feminine grace, and he struggled to show how naturalism, symbolism and realism might be interrelated. It was clearly a struggle to articulate himself in what was becoming to be seen as a rather archaic language. Following his talk, Sorry, this is the most inappropriate image to accompany this bit of the talk. Let's have that one. Following his talk, Kramer wrote a remarkable 18-page letter to Herbert Reed, who is now at the front line in Europe, in an essentially similar vein, but clarifying his intention as an artist. As you know, he said, the degree of expression in the work of art is the measure of its greatness. A spiritual discernment is more essential than the reproduction of the obvious. It is my endeavour to create a purely spiritual form. He continued that only through the use of symbols could he express deeper emotion. Only through symbolism could I express all the ideas accumulated in the ordinary channels. When the natural and spiritual element impinges, which is the word he used, itself on my consciousness, a terrific struggle invariably ensues, and it is by the greatest effort that I am ultimately able to translate the base substance of the detailed naturalness into the essence of spirituality. When you know that the spiritual element is in the ascendancy, it will culminate in a completeness which incorporates both in a manner which is calculated to produce an entire oneness. This is clearly much closer to the language of the post-symbolist aesthetic articulated in Kandinsky's Art of Spiritual Harmony, with its attachment to Leibniz and Bazant's thought forms, than to Hume's more technicist psychological language. Kramer had indeed studied Michael Sadler Jr.'s translation, and though he was well aware of all the contending art movements and manifestos, he ploughed his own furrow. Perhaps, even more remarkably, Reed replied in a 9-page letter from the trenches, in which he pounced upon what he saw as Kramer's unnuanced use of the terms spirit and spiritual, which had so much metaphysical and religious baggage attached to them. Reed claimed he could make more sense of it if he substituted for them the words mind and intuition, and concluded, what I insist on is the spiritual quality is not inherent in the works of art, but in the mind of the artist, or in the mind of the spectator. Thus Reed is much closer to Hume's prescriptions in the pages of the New Age, which he still read at the front. The shifting of aesthetic theory into the more formal language of classical aesthetics and the technical realms of psychology offered for him a modernist discourse that at last broke free from metaphysics. It was then a significant difference of opinion, but interestingly one that Reed was much later to revalue in Kramer's favour. I think, he said later, that in my reply to this letter I must have defended Cubism and the formal values of art, for I was not at that time sufficiently familiar with the alternative values for which Kramer was expounding, those values we now call expressionism. Kramer is, and always has been, an expressionist. He might well have had in mind, hear our voice, O Lord, our God. Otherwise, this could be considered a curious lapse of memory, for Reed was very well aware of Kandinsky's art and theory, and could not anyway have missed it in the Arts Club. But clearly, he had then wanted to move on with the debates in the New Age, and the Rajas offered to him of collecting and introducing Hume's selected writings, which he later published as speculations. Reed was thus moving his own art criticism into a more secular and humanist mode, but rejected Hume's programmatic classicism for a mode that incorporated the Romanticism and pure abstraction for an abstracted pared-down realism. It may also have sanctioned a reappraisal of the language of spirituality. Reed, however, was also becoming an accomplished poet, winning praise from T.S. Eliot, and had already published a volume in 1916. His second volume, Naked Warriors, published in 1919, contained the long and stark autobiographical poem Nishaw Goes to War, the name a Yorkshire play on Nietzsche. In this excerpt, Reed graphically both reports and displays the horror of war, the cathartic effect it had on him, and an odd, steely detachment that enabled him to stand back and reflect on its meaning. It was a remarkable achievement. Nishaw went to war on bleak moors and among harsh fellows they set about with much painstaking to straighten his drooping back. But still his mind reflected things like a cold steel mirror, emotionless. There are few left who will find it hard to forget Polygonfeld. The earth was scarred and broken by torrents of plunging shells, then washed and sodden with autumnal rains. And Polygonbeker, perhaps a rippling stream in the days of Nishaw's gloom, spread itself like a fatal quicksand, a sucking, clutching death. They had to be across the Becker and in their line before dawn. A man who was marching by Nishaw's side hesitated in the middle of the mud and slowly sank, weighted down by equipment and arms. He cried for help. Rifles were stretched to him. He clutched and they tugged, but slowly he sank. His terror grew visibly when the viscous ooze reached his neck. And there he seemed to stick, sinking no more. They could not dig him out. Using mud would flow back again. The dawn was very near. An officer shot him through the head. Not a neat job. The revolver was too close. Despite displaying enormous courage that won for him a military cross and DSO, Reed returned from war a convinced pacifist. After World War II, he campaigned against nuclear war and was arrested on a Committee of 100 sit-down demonstration in 1960. By then he'd become a commanding figure in British art. Thistle would go so far as to maintain that the expressivist formalist axis, which fueled the Arts Club debates, became a principal motivating force for Herbert Reed's own aesthetic theorising, which had a substantial impact during the interwar period. Though they have gone largely unrecognised, Reed's attempt to heal these contrasting modern idioms, expressivism and formalism, proved a crucial shaping influence for 20th century art in England. It could be argued that Reed prepared a wider audience to the reception of modern British sculpture as public art, most significantly that of fellow Yorkshire artists Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, while his principles of art education energised the leading British art schools like the Leeds School of Art under Eric Taylor following World War II. His theories of education through art became widely influential following World War II, and he was instrumental in developing the collections of leading art patrons such as Peggy Guggenheim in New York, and fostering both surrealism and abstract impressionism. Reed's co-founding of the Institute of Contemporary Art in 1947 in London was an attempt, he said, to recreate the energy of the Leeds Club. Kramer, by contrast, never seemed to fulfil his potential and was tragically consumed by alcoholism. Turner never recovered from his treatment as a conscientious objector, and Orage quit the New Age after the war to prepare the USA for the coming of the sage Gurdjieff. Michael Sadler, meanwhile, managed to extend his personal war with Leeds sensibilities into the next decade by commissioning the ill-fated Town Hall panels project, and then the sculptor Eric Gill to create a war memorial for the university, Christ driving at moneylenders. But that, as they say, is another story, and one you will hear next time. His metropolitan friends took close interest. Roger Fly writing that, every time I came to Leeds, I got more and more impressed with the work Sir Michael was doing. He had civilised the whole population. The entire spirit had changed from a rather sullen suspicion of ideas to a genuine enthusiastic and spiritual life. He's shown what can be done, but rarely is, by education. By contrast, a correspondent to the Yorkshire Post described the club as nothing but a load of cranks, and the war with Leeds continued.